Well, it's lovely to see so many of you on a cold, miserable, damp night. And I want to welcome you all very much on behalf of Memorial 2007 to our annual lecture. And we have a real treat today, this evening, because we have the Deputy Mayor, Debbie Weeks-Bernard, who is the first female black Deputy Mayor at City Hall. And I'd like to introduce the Director of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, who is hosting this event, Philip Murphy.
Yeah, thank you all for coming to this fourth annual Memorial 2007 annual lecture, which we're hosting here in the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies. The purpose of the lecture series is to draw attention to the Memorial 2007 campaign, which was launched in 2002 with the initial aim of having a monument, a statue ready for the bicentenary of the parliamentary abolition of the Slave Trade Act of 1807. It was not to be. The memorial is still to be erected. They're still raising money. The campaign is still going strong. But we want to keep this in the public mind. And OCU has managed to attract some very prominent supporters to this campaign, a number of whom have already given lectures in this series. So we began in 2016 with the former Labour politician and High Commissioner of South Africa, Lord Boateng. In 2017, we had Hugh Quashie, the Shakespearean actor. 2018, Afua Hirsch, very well-known journalist and writer, and now we're absolutely delighted to have the Deputy Mayor of London, Debbie Weeks-Bernard, to speak to us. And the number and the prominence of the supporters that we've managed to attract, that the campaign has managed to attract, says an awful lot for the perseverance and dedication of the team behind Memorial 2007. I mention in particular Oku Ekpenyon, who has been absolutely tireless in this. She began her career teaching in an inner London secondary school and became aware of the lack of visibility of black history in this country and decided to do something about it. And she has a number of major achievements to her name. She campaigned to have a portrait of the 19th century African-American actor Ira Aldrich unveiled at the Old Vic. She campaigned successfully for the Royal Mail to issue a series of stamps in 2007 for the bicentenary. And in 2010, her efforts were awarded by an MBE in the Queen's Birthday Honours List. And I also mention Audrey Edwards, who is another co-founder of the Memorial 2007 campaign. Audrey established a career in the financial side of the newspaper industry and has acted as trustee and treasurer of Memorial 2007. So we recognise her wonderful contribution here tonight. And so it falls to me with the very happy task of introducing Dr. Debbie Weeks-Bernard. She joined County Hall in 2018 as Deputy Mayor with special responsibility for social integration, social mobility, and community engagement. She came to City Hall from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, where she led the organisation's work on poverty and ethnicity, and prior to that, she worked at the Runnymede Trust as head of research. And indeed, it was Omar Khan, the director of the Runnymede Trust, who's recently written, "It's unacceptable that the capital of a nation that built a global empire and its wealth in large part as a result of its role in the slave trade has no significant museum or monument marking the role of London and Britain in these historic atrocities." And this is something that Memorial 2007 is working hard to put right. Debbie is also a trustee of the Equality and Diversity Forum, has sat on a number of influential panels, including the Poverty Commissions of the National Union of Students and the London Borough of Lewisham. So there's no one better to talk about her chosen topic tonight, hidden racialized voices. Debbie, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation to speak this evening. I'm really honoured to be joining such a list of illustrious speakers as Afua and you and Paul, and I'd like to thank OKU and the Memorial 2017 for inviting me to speak this evening and for allowing me to join that list of speakers who have addressed the annual lecture of the 2007 Memorial Annual Lecture Series. And what I'd like to do this evening is to talk a little bit about visibility. And the reason that I'd like to talk about visibility is for a number of reasons, two main reasons. One is a personal reason, and one is a reason which relates to the shift that I think we're seeing in the way in which prominent voices of colour are taking centre stage. And what that does is make the arguments that they put forward that much more visible. And I'd like to talk about the opportunities as well as the challenges that go alongside with becoming more visible as a person of colour, and what you use your responsibility of being more visible to do. And so the personal reason that I'd like to talk about visibility is because I have never been more visible. I became the Deputy Mayor in 2018. It's the most visible role I've ever held. Prior to that, I was supremely happy and comfortable taking my fist at the government in the variety of different roles that I'd held, either as a researcher, as an activist, as a policy leader, as a funder, trying to ensure that the voices of those which are frequently unheard were heard. And the role that I now have enables me to say all of those things all the time, very publicly, which often then means that I'm more easily scrutinised by the things that I say. And so I want to talk about what one should be doing, or what one can do when one is thrust into the limelight in this way, the political limelight, and how important it is to use your visibility, particularly as a person of colour, to make structural changes where you can. And I'd like to talk about some of the ways in which I've tried to do that, but some of the reasons why it's been incredibly difficult to be able to do that. And I think there is a conundrum which is sort of at the basis of talking about visibility. One is that people of colour are incredibly visible. I don't need to speak to any of you here in this room about the way in which racial discrimination works and what it does to people of colour. And so, for example, I don't need to tell you all about the fact that many of us face concrete ceilings rather than glass ceilings when we're trying to progress in the variety of different labour markets that we try to access. I don't need to tell you all about the difficulties that young black men in particular face when they're trying to get into labour markets, and that if you're young and you're black and you live in London, you're more likely to be unemployed here than anywhere else in the whole of the UK. I don't need to tell you all about the way in which serious youth violence impacts upon young people of colour in our cities. And I also don't need to tell you about the way in which the voices of people of colour are often missing from the way in which we talk about race and racism. So the conundrum is that all of these issues make us incredibly visible. It means that whenever you talk about racism and the way it impacts upon people's lives, it makes black people visible by virtue of the fact that we are talking about them. But at the same time, because we are not the author of our stories or our narratives, it renders us invisible. And that's why Memorial 2007 is so incredibly important. It's important because what Oku and her team are trying to do, really importantly, is to put back into the way in which we talk about the impact of the transatlantic slave trade, the voices and the experiences of the enslaved. To move it away from a focus just on abolition and to move the discussion away from a focus on abolition which only ever talks about the work and the endeavour of William Wilberforce, for example. And so the work that she has done, the work that her team has done, is incredibly important for reinserting into that dialogue the voices of the enslaved, of people of colour. And that's the way in which, across a variety of different issues and a variety of different social problems, we are not the authors of our narratives. So I'd like to just give you a bit of an analogy just to describe what I mean by that and how I discovered once upon a time just how invisible I was and how invisible lots of people can be and can find themselves being. So I did a PhD once upon a time. And after doing a PhD, I spent some time in the third sector working for an organisation which was principally concerned with trying to get young people of colour, young black and Asian people who had potential into roles in which they could thrive, giving them internships, giving them work experience. The organisation is called the Women's Fellowship, for any of you who might know the organisation that I'm referring to. I spent some time working for them. And then after a spell of working in that organisation, I decided to take a career break. And as part of my career break, I decided to go to law school, because that's what one does when they have a career break. They don't sit at home and have a career break, they actually go off and do something else. So I went to graduate law school. I went to a law school, which I won't name, but it was a law school which was heavily populated by young people who had recently left Oxbridge. So these were young people who had recently done PPEs, they'd done a variety of different great degrees, either at Oxford or at Cambridge. And I was in my mid-30s and I'd never come across individuals like this before, ever, which is interesting. I don't know how I've managed to spend that much of my life never coming across an Oxbridge graduate, but there you go. So I was at a law school with these individuals, and one of the things that consumed a lot of our time, which I think consumes a lot of the time of lots of young people who are trying to get into the law profession, was just how difficult and how competitive the law profession is, and how many strategies one has to try to go through to try to progress within it. And these were young people who had thought about this at length. I hadn't given it as much thought as they had given it, and that's largely because they'd almost been groomed to think about this stuff. So they'd gone to Oxbridge, they'd gone and done their history degrees, their politics degrees. They knew that the next step on their journey would be to do this graduate qualification, and then they would be able to access those elusive pupillages in chambers, those elusive training contracts in the most high-performing law firms in the city. And many of them had lots of contacts. They had a dad, or a friend of a dad, or a parent, or a family member, or somebody who either worked in the law profession, either running a chamber or working in HR, who was able to give them some of those, some of that access to those elusive pupillages and training contracts that I spoke of. And in this particular law school, there were only a very small handful of non-traditional entrants. I was one of those individuals, and the non-traditional entrants were usually people who had children and were going back into study, or they were young people who'd come from low-income backgrounds. There weren't many of them, to be clear. or there were other individuals who, hadn't come through the Oxbridge route. A large proportion of those people were of colour, but then a large proportion of them were also individuals who'd come through a variety of different routes to come to that law school. So many of them had been the first in their families to go to university, etc. Now, at that particular time, I was of interest to many of these Oxbridge graduates because I had a PhD. They didn't have a PhD. And they found that quite interesting. And so they were trying to share with me the strategies that they thought that I ought to adopt to try to get my foot in the door into the law profession. And so they suggested, very honestly and very openly, that one thing that I should think about doing would be to use the race card. And I had never, up until that point, ever heard the phrase the race card. I'd spent time working on race equality issues, but had never heard the term used before in my life. And what they said was, what I should do is use the fact of my existence, so the fact that I was both black and female, and therefore had experienced enormous disadvantage, to try to get my foot into the door. Now, I had been black and female all my life, up until that point, and I had never experienced the fact of my existence as something opening the doors. In fact, it had led to many doors closing rather than having any doors open. But they felt that the way in which to get ahead would be to draw on the fact that you are either of colour, you either have a disability, you're female, you have some other equality strand issue to draw upon, and use that as a way of negotiating your way into a really good set or a really good law firm. Now, I was troubled for two reasons by this assumption. For all sorts. Only two reasons. Well, there were many reasons, but there were two main reasons. The first was that I knew that this was a narrative which existed about me and others like me that had not come from me, and that it had not come from any person of colour that I could identify. This was a narrative that these individuals had more or less constructed for themselves and thought that they were being helpful by using it. And it was a narrative that they used quite openly and thought that it was something that I ought to be taking advantage of. So they were quite disturbed by my response. The second reason that I was troubled by that narrative was that if there were a woman of colour who had accessed one of those elusive pupilages or training contracts, the perception of those individuals was that that woman had not been able to access that pupillage or training contract by merit. She hadn't been able to access it through her talent, through her expertise, through any other way of getting that pupillage other than the fact of her existence. So she had got that because somebody had felt sorry for her and had given her a chance. And it occurred to me that not only was this a quite widely used narrative, but it also occurred to me that this was a bit of a narrative used by individuals who felt that these were things that they deserved to access. And if somebody else was in their place, it was a place that had been taken from them. And the only way to rationalise that person having that place was to make up an excuse that suggested that they had only got it because someone had felt sorry for them, had given them a chance. And when I'd spoken to some of the other individuals of colour who were in law school with me at the time, many of them would say to me that they thought the whole concept of positive action or positive discrimination was problematic. And they thought it was problematic, and they clearly were aware of this narrative, and I had no idea about it. They felt it was problematic because they felt that if they were able to access any kind of position, that there was a presumption that they had not accessed that position by merit. And so they felt that equality legislation was problematic, and it made things difficult for people of colour or people from a variety of different equality strands in the labour market. Now, the reason that I've used that as an example is because I clearly, myself and the one other black woman who was in a cohort of 200, that I was incredibly visible. She was incredibly visible. Those of us who were non-traditional applicants, law students, we were all incredibly visible. But we had no control over the narratives that were being used to describe us, or were being used or circulating about us. And that's what makes visibility problematic. Sometimes you can be there and be symbolic by your presence, but if you have no control over the narrative which exists about you and about the community that you're from, then your mere presence means nothing. It provides false promises. And so what I think one should be able to do, if you get to a position of some prominence where you're able to use your voice to try to make a difference, is to try to subvert that. So I've got 4 suggestions as to the things that we could do to try to do that. And I'm going to see if they work on here. Right, so these are the 4. And these are 4 that I've used, that I'm continuing to use, and that I've been using for the past year. So the first is that you need to use your visibility strategically. Now that doesn't mean that you have to play tricks or be creative or lie. It means that what you have to do is you need to use your visibility to make a difference for groups around you by drawing on your lived experience, by drawing on your lived experience, by drawing on the lived experiences of others around you, and by using that to make sure that what you do is more than just being symbolic. And you need to use your visibility to make an active, proactive change. Now there's lots of people of colour who I greatly admire. Many of them are politicians, many of them are writers, many of them are individuals who are doing great and incredible work. And I don't just like them because they are the only ones out there using their voices. I like them and I admire them because they are using their voices to do something practical, to make a practical change in the lives of others around them. And the second thing that I think is incredibly important is that you have to use your visibility to create platforms for unheard voices and erased voices. Now, I've mentioned that that's kind of where I would put the Memorial 2007 project. It's an attempt to try to replace or to re-enter into a discourse those voices which have been removed or which are not heard. But there are a variety of other ways in which you can try to do that. So, for example, in October at City Hall, we brought together a group of young people to come and talk to us about serious youth violence. The reason for doing that is because we know that young people of colour, particularly in this city, are the ones who are most at risk of experiencing harm or experiencing serious violence. And so we brought these young people into City Hall, and they came from pupil referral units or from alternative provision centres. And for many of those young people, many had never been to City Hall before. For some of them, they'd never been outside of their own areas before. So coming to City Hall was a big deal. And so we really wanted them to have a great experience, but also we wanted those young people to feel as though City Hall was their home. It's a place in which they belonged. They have as much right to access it as anyone else does. And so we brought them to City Hall, and we said that we wanted to ask them their views on what they think are the best ways to tackle serious violence and serious youth violence. Now, the reason that we do that is important. Now, I have a PhD. I've worked in the equality sector for over 20 years. I could quite happily go and sit down with the Mayor Sadiq and say, you know what, I know what the solutions are to tackling serious youth violence. I mean, I don't know what all of them are, but I could have a good stab at it. And I could say, you know, these are the academics, these are the third sector organisations, these are the people who know what it's like and can give us the ideas, and we should use what they say as a way of developing interventions. But I'm not a young person, unfortunately. I'm not a young person, and I am not as at risk of harm or as at risk of serious violence as my son, for example, who is a young person. I don't feel as afraid of walking the streets or navigating my local area as perhaps he will do in a couple of years. I mean, he does it now, he's 11 and he thinks everything is great. And he walks around with his phone in his hand because he thinks that's fine to do. You shouldn't do that, and if you've got any young children, tell them to put their phones in their bags because it's actually ridiculous that he does that continuously. But I recognise that even though I am the person to whom the mayor would turn to for answers about some of these issues, I cannot give him those answers with real integrity because I don't experience them. And so what I think is important, and one of the things that we try to do as much as possible, is to use our powers to provide platforms for those individuals who have the answers to some of those issues. So young people in particular are very rarely asked their view about what would be the best way to tackle serious youth violence, even though they are the ones who are most at risk. And those young people who came to City Hall that day, and indeed those young people who come to City Hall frequently to meet with members of my team, who meet with Jeanette, who's here from the Violence Reduction Unit, these are young people who are very rarely asked their views, but when you do ask them, they are so happy to have been given the opportunity to contribute to a dialogue and a set of solutions which will directly benefit them. And that's the most important way that you can use your visibility to provide a platform for people who are the best placed to know what would work for them. Otherwise, you will come up with interventions and solutions which may not hit the mark, and we have a responsibility not to do that. The third area is around evidence, and I would say this because I have spent a long part of my career being a researcher, but evidence and lived experience creates change. So I always use evidence as a way of backing up my arguments. I always have done. When I've worked in the space of race equality, the best way to try to get a decision maker to change his or her mind is to use evidence about an issue. So, for example, we know that we're currently in an election period now. I'm politically restricted, which means that I'm not allowed to talk about the election in a way that might sway anybody's opinion, so I'm not going to do that. But it is a fact that we are in an election period. Hope you're all going to vote on Thursday. One of the things that the Runnymede Trust have done very recently has point out the fact that whenever a broadcaster or a set of journalists is seeking a view about the election, or indeed whenever a broadcaster wants to test the public mood, they very rarely will find a young black man in Hackney, for example, or a young Asian woman in Manchester. Whenever a broadcaster seeks to talk about Brexit, they very rarely choose or select people of colour to give their viewpoints. Now, people of colour vote all the time. People of colour voted in the referendum in 2016. People of colour have views on the economy. They have views on universal credit. They have views on the NHS. They have views on immigration. They have views on all of these things. But they are very rarely asked publicly what their views are. And the issue with this is that all of these issues that I've listed are issues which disproportionately impact them, yet their views are not part of the way that we form our own view of an issue if we watch, say, the BBC or ITV. And the issue with that is that lived experience, or the experiences that people have of something, should be seen as evidence. And if we had a more rounded view of what those people felt about an issue, then we'd have a more rounded view of that issue. So, for example, we know that if you're from a minority ethnic background, you're more likely to live in poverty, and you're more likely to have lived in poverty for over 20 years. Over half of Bangladeshi and Pakistani individuals live in poverty. Around 40 to 50% of black communities live in poverty across the whole of the UK. But when it comes to getting a vox pop on universal credit, you won't see those individuals being interviewed. But they have a disproportionate experience of the thing which makes universal credit important. When it comes to the economy, for example, and talking about the workplace or the labour market, we know that for the most part, those from minority ethnic backgrounds are those who are most likely to be propping up the gig economy. They're most likely to be found in those insecure jobs which are low paid and which are very insecure. But if there's a vox pop on the gig economy, or if there's a vox pop on insecure work, very rarely will you see a person being interviewed who is of colour. And so that means that we only ever get a partial view of that issue. And that means that we are not working or making decisions based on proper evidence. My view is that we should use lived experience not only as evidence, but we should get better at deciding who we ask to help us to get that data set that we need to make more informed views about an issue. And so I think that it's really important for us to use evidence and use lived experience as a way of trying to make a change. And there's a couple of ways that we've tried to do that at City Hall, and I'd like to list a couple of those in just a second. So the final issue, or the final way that in which I've tried to use visibility as a way to make change is to fuel aspiration. And this is about using your platform to do something which will inspire not just the next generation, but inspire everyone else. Now, since I've been in the role, one of the things that I've tried to do is to see if I can send out an image from City Hall about minority ethnic groups, which is a bit more positive than the sort of image that we might ordinarily see. So you may all be very aware that the Mayor is incredibly concerned about serious youth violence. I've mentioned it about 100 times since I've stood here. But if we were to think about those who are most likely to be a victim of serious youth violence, or those who are most likely to be seen as perpetrators of serious youth violence, we would be talking about a certain subsect of society, largely in London, young men of colour. And one of the things that I think is incredibly important is to send out an image which is that not all of the things that we care about in City Hall are about young men of colour being involved in crime. Now, there are around, I think it's less than 1% of the population of young black men are involved in crime. 99% of young black men in London are not involved in any criminal activity whatsoever. But you would think, from the way in which we talk about violence, or we talk about some of the issues which are important to our communities, that it's impacting on all young black men or all young men of colour, and that simply statistically is not the case. And what I've wanted to do is to make sure that we send out an image not just to the rest of society, but to those young black men themselves, that there are other things about being young and black, or being of colour, which are positive, which are amazing. There are people who are doing wonderful things in our communities. We've got a Booker Prize winner, who's a woman of colour. We should be talking about that and shouting that from the rooftops, rather than only ever focusing on the problems or the specific issues. So there are a couple of things that we've tried to do at City Hall, which are about sending out that positive image. One of them is a project that I'm incredibly proud of. We've called it WIN. It's called the Workforce Integration Network. And it's a project where I've used the data, and the data which tells us that if you're young and you're black and you're male, you're more likely to be unemployed in London. And I've used that data to do that positive action thing, the thing that all of those law students of colour that I spoke to initially, that I mentioned initially, were very frightened of and were very worried about. So I've designed a project which is specifically for young black men. And yes, we have received all sorts of criticisms for doing that, but the best argument to use on that issue is that young black men have always had the highest unemployment rate. They've had the highest unemployment rate in London for an incredibly long time. And what that means is that if you've been engaging in a set of initiatives which are just about youth unemployment, and those young black men have continued to have those consistently high levels of unemployment, then the universalist approach does not work. And that means you need to do the targeted thing. So the WIN programme is specifically about that. So in April of this year, first week of the Easter holidays, we held a jobs fair, which was associated with our Workforce Integration Network. We got a group of employers into the Institute of Engineering, just a few yards away from Westminster, to come in with live vacancies for young black men who were interested in working in the sector. And we opened it up to young black men, and 150 turned up. The event started at 11. At 9 a.m. they were queuing up outside to come in, and they came on their own. They came with their friends, they came with their parents, they came with youth workers, they came with trusted adults, they came in their tracksuits, they came in their suits. 150 turned up, we had a waiting list of 300. And the reason that I mention that is not just because it filled me with such pride, because I was there and I saw them all, was because it subverted that stereotype about the only thing that young black men are interested in are being involved in criminality, or the only thing that we can associate with this group of young men, some of whom were wearing said tracksuits, which can cause some people a little bit of angst when they see them in said tracksuits, is to be involved in criminality. But these young men, they wanted work, they wanted opportunities, they wanted internships, they wanted people to give them the chance and the opportunity to thrive and to shine. And we did that, and they did what we expected them to do. And it's still one of my favourite projects, simply because it's one of the ways in which they themselves showed us how misunderstood they are as a group and subverted those stereotypes for themselves. There's another project that we ran during Black History Month. It was called the Smiling Boys Project, and it's another project that I love. Now, you're all going to think that the only thing I talk about is young black boys. Well, I've got one at home, and so I do talk about them an awful lot, but I think it's largely because this is a group which is a much maligned group in society. And so I'm really keen to do all we can to try to subvert some of those stereotypes about this particular group. And the Smiling Boys is a very simple photographic exhibition by an artist called Kay Rafai, and he took some pictures of a group of boys in their school uniform, and they were smiling, and that was simply it. A set of pictures of some smiling black boys in their school uniform. And we exhibited at City Hall. Everybody who came in and walked past it on their way to get a coffee, on their way to get their lunch, couldn't help but smile. And it's not just that you smile when you see someone else smiling, because that is also what happens, but it's because it kind of subverted that notion that black boys don't smile. Because they do smile, and they can smile. And when they smile, it's actually really quite transformative. And it reminded me of a short film that formed part of the BFI London Film Festival this year, which was called Serious Teens. It's a very short film, and it was basically a film which showed a load of young men in a variety of parts of London who were frowning. They were frowning at each other, they were frowning at the sky, they were just frowning. And then at one point they got every single young man in that film to simply smile. And the smile was transformative. And I think what's important about this is that it's not just that counter to popular belief that young black men and young boys can smile. It's that society doesn't give them a lot to smile about. So when they do smile, people are surprised by the smiling. Now, the fact that I mentioned that is it was a very simple way of subverting a set of stereotypes, but it was incredibly powerful. Everyone loved it. Kay Rafai is a great photographer. And it was part of a series of bits of work that we've been doing at City Hall, which are called Black Presence, which is about subverting stereotype and is about promoting positivity and is about showing the world the amazing role models that exist out there for young people to look to and to be inspired by. Because we have to be very clear, in the current climate in which we are in, there isn't an awful lot for many young people of colour to aspire to. They're often, the sorts of images that exist around young people are not incredibly positive for them. And so we have to do what we can and to use our platforms to try to make a difference in their lives. So these are the ways in which I've tried very much to use my visibility to make changes. I've used my visibility to try to signal that it's more than just symbolic that I am the first black female deputy mayor. Because when you've got firsts, or when you get onlys, they're only successful or amazing when a person uses that opportunity to do something great. It's really easy to just become symbolic. I could have sat on my hands for a year. Well, I couldn't. No, I don't think Sadiq would have let me. But I could have. I could have sat on my hands for a year. I could have done nothing. I could have just gone along, shook some hands, opened some things, given out some awards. Could have done that. That would have been great. But that's not what I'm about. I've come from the third sector. I've been an activist. I know how important it is to use your role to do this. And also I know how rare it is, and I know how temporary it is. I won't have this job forever. I won't have this opportunity forever. So I have to use this opportunity to the best of my ability to make a difference. So I hope that the 4 strategies that I've listed have given you some food for thought. What I want this to be is not just about, isn't it great that I can come up with these 4? I want this to be an opportunity to find out from those of you who are all using your own platforms to do amazing things, to see if these things resonate with you, if there are other strategies that you might use. Because you're all here because you believe in what Oku is doing. You're all here because you believe in Memorial 2007. You believe that there needs to be something which marks slavery. You believe that there should be something which gives people of colour something to look to and be inspired by. And so that means that all of you in your own individual ways are using your own platforms to do good. And so I'm more interested, to be honest, in how you use your roles to do good than talking about how I use my role to do good, because I know what I'm doing. And so I talk about this stuff all the time to my husband until he's bored. So I'm more interested in finding out from you about what you do in your own everyday roles. But please do be aware. This stuff is incredibly important to me, to my team, to those of us who are of colour in positions of authority. I think as long as we can continue to use our roles and use our visibility to make a difference in the lives, not just of ourselves, but of the communities that we are from and the communities who look to us for guidance, then I think that we've done a good job.
Thank you, Debbie. I think Debbie has given us a lot to think about and to really challenge. And there is this issue of being invisible, and it is important that we are more visible. And I found this in quite a personal way, because even though I've been involved in this project for a long time, I have felt that I have held back in my visibility as such. But in recent times, I have been more visible in a number of ways. And in fact, today, although I haven't had a chance to read it, I did an interview for The Guardian on Saturday, and it's in the paper today, and it's about the memorial. And I hope that this will raise the visibility of the project, because we have been working on this memorial for so long, and as Debbie said, visibility is really important. And I will expand on that a bit more a bit later. But in the meantime, I'd like to invite any of you to put a question to Debbie if you have any questions. Anyone? Thank you.
I just wanted to ask, you sort of touched on it earlier in regards to you being a woman and a woman of colour. And that leaves you incredibly vulnerable and even more sort of in an unequal position, especially in terms of the light of work that you do. So you've spoken about the programmes that you were involved in terms of promoting black men, black boys, in terms of sort of pushing them forward. Now also as a black woman, I feel that we are in no way less than a black man in terms of equality, because we have a lot of other stuff to worry about. There's sexual violence out there, there's exploitation of women, there's all types of other issues that women face alone, and then on top of that being a person of colour, whoever they are. So I was just wondering, what sort of programmes have you been involved in terms of that, or what would you like to progress in terms of that sort of work, or if you have any ideas on that, what you would like to see happen in terms of for the women and young girls.
That's a really good question. My PhD was about young black girls, and I remember when I decided to do that PhD, that lots of people said that I was kind of wasting the opportunity, that I should be focusing on people who are experiencing real problems. I remember I was very young at the time and I was very disheartened because I was thinking, well, I'm a young black girl, so don't you think that I'm important? And so I took it quite personally. And so I've always wanted to champion young black women, largely because they are a very invisible group. They're invisible in policy, they're invisible in the academy. I spent a lot of time as an academic trying to promote this work. One of the things that I've always been particularly clear about is that when I talk about using lived experience or trying to be authentic, trying to be an authentic leader, that all of that stems from those sorts of experiences that I had before when I was trying to do something that I considered to be important and that I still consider to be important. And so very recently I spoke at Black Girl Fest, which is an event run by Paula Akpan and Nicole Crensville. And it was an incredibly amazing event that I went to. And I mentioned this at our Black History Month reception because it was, I think, the first time that I'd ever seen so many black women in Islington. Islington was completely taken over by black women pushing prams, black women with walking sticks, black women of a range of different ages, different social classes. It was wonderful. It was amazing. But one of the things that was raised by many of the women that I spoke to is how invisible they felt. They were trying to get into social policy, trying to get into politics, trying to get into various sectors, not seeing themselves represented, and asking me for my advice as to ways that they should, try to push themselves forward. So I've always maintained that as far as possible, if you can, try to bring yourself to wherever you are. There is this saying that if you're LGBT+, you should be able to bring yourself to work. If you're a person of colour, you should be able to bring yourself to work. You should be able to bring yourself to school, to uni, to wherever. And I know bringing yourself to anywhere has huge risks because there's all sorts of stereotypes associated with doing that. I spent a lot of my time telling my children not to bring themselves to school because I think that teachers might not necessarily want to see that side of them and to save that bit for at home. But actually, I shouldn't have done that. I should have allowed them to feel free to express themselves. I think it's really interesting that you raised the point. I spoke to the team that run the Precious Awards very recently. And one of the things that they're really keen to try to do is to think about ways to promote and support young women of colour who are interested in getting involved in business, getting involved in entrepreneurship, and are seeking mentorship or seeking advice and guidance, and to use the Precious Awards as a way of trying to promote young black women as well as women of colour, older women of colour. And I'm sorry. So the Precious Awards, right? So the Precious Awards are they're an awards system which are specifically for women of colour. They give awards to prominent women in a variety of different sectors. One of the sectors is business. They also give awards to women in the third sector and in other sectors. It's a very small awards, it's a very small group, but it's about trying to champion and highlight the contribution that women of colour make. And I've been speaking to them about ways that we can work together because the only way to try to address invisibility is to do work which is about promoting and highlighting and championing those women who are doing really great things in their own right. So it's something that I'm really interested in doing, and I'm hoping that I can do some more in the time that I have available to me in the world.
Thank you very much for that lecture. Many things interested me, especially when you talked about research, and you did research a lot. I depend a lot on research in the job that I do, and I'll say a little bit about that in a moment. But I also like what you said about stereotypes and how important that is for us. Now, one of the things I'm concerned about is the kind of messages that's coming out of the town hall often, especially we living in a period of so much violence with young men. And we know that one of the biggest stereotypes of black men on the whole is one of being violent. It seems to me that one of the things coming out is that, well, like somehow boxing is the answer for everything. If you got Alzheimer's, go do boxing. If you want to do fitness, go do boxing. Now, some of the research I've looked at, and the work I did was working with violent men, I was working with perpetrators of domestic violence for a very long time. And some of the research I've looked at clearly says that, you know, when you stereotype men as being violent, you know, you encourage more violence. Particularly the research that I saw is around boxing in particular, that whenever there was a heavyweight fight, and if it's two black men fighting, more black men will die in the streets next day. Now, we see how boxing is being promoted for schools, for almost everything. You know, form a gym, you know, these guys are behaving bad, let's put them, get them boxing, that's the answer. You know, somehow that's going to solve our problem with violence in this society. And I wondered how you could use your position within the town hall to change that narrative. There's something really wrong about it. It gets me so angry when I see it being promoted. Thank you.
So shall I answer? Okay, so it's a good point. So I personally don't like boxing. I didn't watch the fight on Saturday with Anthony Joshua. It was well done to him, but I didn't watch it. I've never liked it. But you are right, there are initiatives which exist, some of which are funded out of City Hall, which are focused on sport, not just on boxing, but on sport. And we have used sport as a way to provide diversionary activities for young people who are at risk. And I think, so there's a couple of things I suppose to highlight in respect of that. One of the things that we have to make sure that we do is we meet young people where they're at. So when you want to try to get young people away from a situation which is troubling for them or which puts them at risk, you need to put them into something which they're going to enjoy, which they have said they're going to enjoy, rather than imposing something on them, and something which will keep them coming back regularly to keep them away from other influences. Some of those things are sport related. They're not all boxing related, but some of them are either around football or around basketball or around other sporting initiatives or sporting activities that some young men and some young people generally are interested in. But we don't just use our funding for those issues. So we have a pot of money that we've called the Young Londoners Fund, and we use that fund not just to use diversionary activities that will keep young people away from crime and safe through sports, but we also look at mental health and ways of giving young people the opportunity to talk about the issues which trouble them and to get them to open up about some of the issues which can sometimes lead them into difficulty, because we know that we have a mental health crisis with young people, and we certainly have a mental health crisis with young people who find themselves at risk of violence, because these are young people who often are living lives which are difficult and which are challenging, which they shouldn't be in and which we should be protecting them from. But as a result, many of them have huge mental health difficulties. So we use some of the funds that we have to provide young people with the opportunity, sometimes just to talk, but also to receive the counselling and the guidance that they need to keep them resilient and to keep them strong, so that when they are faced with making difficult decisions, they can make the right decisions. We also use the fund to try to provide them with other activities which can keep them away from violence. And so I know that I think it's an important point that you make about boxing. And I suppose my argument will be that we've tried to find activities and initiatives run by those in communities who have the answers or are working with young people at risk and have said to us, this is what we know works with this particular cohort. So we work with those who we think have the expertise. I don't think we would ever want to say to anyone, we think boxing works and therefore we're only going to fund boxing charities. We always go with, or we are led by, what the community tells us they think will work for the cohort that they have worked with. Because we know that we have a massive youth funding crisis, not just in London but across the whole of the UK. We've got youth workers who do incredible things in their community, but they've lost funding, they've lost work, they've lost centres, they've lost access to the ability to do what they do well. So we want to do what we can, whilst the government is kind of making up its mind as to whether or not it's going to give us any money to do this stuff. So we use the money to support those who we think are the best placed to help some of our most vulnerable
Thank you very much for the talk. You got me thinking about a lot of things, but I want to go back to that story about the young lawyers and your kind of the worry that people had that even certainly with positive discrimination, even with positive action, they would be seen as only there because of their colour. But I'm also, and when looking at your sort of 4 principles, I'm also thinking of the other principle about the need for structural change. And I mean, some of the examples you gave at the end are about structural change. But I wonder what you would think about an approach similar perhaps to the approaches happen with relation to gender sometimes, a recognition that half or more of the population are female. Therefore, in some posts and in some political parties, there's a principle that at least half of those who take the posts have to be female. Bearing in mind that in our city, the proportion of people of colour is now very high. To say to law firms, to employers, or for that matter in City Hall, that at least the proportion representing the population of people employed in future should be, proportion of people of colour should be that. It would mean initially that some people would be seen as only there because of their colour. And it would need the kind of support structures but to deal with the inequality of support and opportunity that the WING project that you mentioned has. But in the long term, surely it's to have that sort of principle can enable the structural change, which means in the long term, if we believe that all people, if they're given the same opportunities, have the same chance to, and the same chance to reach those positions, to sort of move towards that. So what would you think about a structural change which would simply say that you work towards, from now on, employing a proportion at least that reflects the population of the city?
So I think it's a good idea. I would say that. I think that, so setting targets to help you to try to change your workforce or diversify your workforce is important, and you have to start somewhere. So I actually think that the legislation gives us the opportunity or allows us to do some of that work, and if we do it, we're not breaking the law at all. I know that I think there's been some research that's been done in the US which has shown that when it comes to positive discrimination, there are some people of colour who have worried about positive discrimination for the very reason that I mentioned. And they feel as though they're seen as not as worthy as everyone else in a work environment or in a university environment or whatever environment. And so there is a piece of work that needs to go alongside trying to support increasing or diversifying a workforce or a university or a school or whatever. which shows that there is leadership support for whatever it is that you're trying to do. But then at the same time, I think the thing that we sometimes don't get right is the support that we provide for those individuals who get into that space. And that's where it gets really sticky. So if we look at what's happened in the higher education system, all of that really important widening participation work that has happened over many years to try to increase the numbers from minority ethnic groups and from low-income groups getting into university has been incredibly successful. But we have a high dropout rate. I think in London we have one of the highest dropout rates of black students in their first year of study. What that suggests is that if we have a set of strategies which is only about getting people through the door, that's only part of the story. You have to provide the support for them once they're actually in the institution or in the place or wherever it is that we've encouraged them to go. Because I think no one can say in London, definitely, that we have an issue with unemployment of all groups. I know that unemployment for young black men is high, but most minority ethnic groups are in the workplace, but it's where they're at. So they're at some of the lowest tiers. And what we need to get better at doing is providing them with the support that they need to progress up the hierarchy, which means that we can't just think about access to a thing, we have to think about support whilst you're in there. I think universities are trying, for example, they're trying to get better at doing that. But at the moment, I think we've been too focused on the getting in the door bit and not as focused on what happens once you're in, and we need to get better at doing that.
And James?
Yes.
Thank you. I just wanted to first make a brief comment, and that was that what you said about people not being interviewed on media about things that affect them. And in one of my roles is as a local councillor. And what I have found is that it's people who are at the sharpest end of everything who don't get heard. And it's because they have the same experience as everybody else, but just more so. Mm-hmm. In everything, it's just more. And that doesn't get heard. So that's true. But I want to pick up on something which relates to the last question. And that is the difficulty of having institutional affirmative action, positive discrimination, what way to describe it, and it not being symbolic or tokenistic. Because it also, once it's institutionalized, and just get out of the European North American context, in India, there has been affirmative action for people of the most oppressed class for 70 years. That is now, no politician will dare take it away. But yet, what has happened is that in these groups themselves, people now talk about, and it's a dreadful term, a creamy layer having been created of people who benefit from these educational places, from these jobs, and then their children are best placed to benefit from these reservations themselves, and and they represent a small minority of the disadvantaged social groups. So how do we avoid dangers like that while bringing about the kind of structural change that the previous questioner spoke about?
Sorry, can I just, it was a point of clarification. Are you saying that strategies to get more people into the workplace, they've been successful, and then what's happened is that you now have just a small number of those more disadvantaged groups in the labour market?
Yeah, I mean, because where this takes place is in government jobs and in elected positions from village councils upwards. And so what happens is that people from the same families tend, because you are creating a class within that particular oppressed group. And while most people, yes, they're happy that symbolically people who belong to the same group are out there in front, but most people are not benefiting from it, and they remain still in the disadvantaged position that they were in.
Wow, that's really interesting. I mean, I suppose that's like that's nepotism is occurring, but in a different way, or in a way that was unexpected. I suppose the thing with trying to do positive action type initiatives is that what we should be doing is using the evidence at our disposal. So if we know that there are certain groups who are least likely to access a thing, we try to target our attention to those groups and try to give them access and give them the opportunities to thrive. But then if other inequalities then open up as a result of what we're doing, then we need to be live to those inequalities. I think sometimes, I guess, we can take the eye off the ball. There is a kind of a real sort of notion that you tick a box and you've done what you needed to do, and then you can just leave it at that. The work of the person that promotes equalities is never done, because new equalities are continuously opening up for different groups. So, for example, equality legislation as it exists at the moment does cover all of the equality strands that, such as ethnicity, faith, gender, sexual orientation, etc. It doesn't include low income, which it should, and as a result, we do now have a situation where you can get someone speaking on a television show, for example, talking about their views for making a certain change, and you get lots of individuals saying, why can this person not speak Queen's English? Referring to people's accents as though that's a problem. And you create all sorts of new and different types of stereotypes and discriminations, etc. And so we need to make sure that our legislative process keeps up with the way in which inequalities open up for different groups. We should definitely have low-income groups in there, but also at City Hall, we not only focus on the equality strands and those from low-income groups, we focus on migrants, we focus on care leavers, we focus on people in care. Now, these are not individuals who are covered by equality legislation, but they are groups in London who've experienced some of the biggest barriers, and we know that because we've looked at the data, and that's what it's told us. So in the situation that you're describing, clearly there needs to be a continuous look at who are the individuals who are not benefiting from a process. Because if there are still people who are not benefiting from a process, then your process is broken and it needs to be revisited, in my view.
Hello. Sadiq Khan was my local MP for a while back, and I did meet him on more than one occasion. It's personally, the equality legislation that's there isn't working in any case. I mean, we've had equal opportunity, and many big employers are equal opportunity employers, but there's one thing that you don't get as a black person or person of colour, and that is an equal opportunity. It's might put it to a few people that yes, we've been granted freedom. But we've never been granted equality, and the only equality that matters is equality of opportunity. It's fraternity, we can say we could lead, but we must have freedom, we must have equality, because freedom without equality is pretty meaningless. It's the initiatives that we discuss and have been discussed for so long. I think personally, and I felt very strongly, that the people that we have, the visible people that we have, we describe them, haven't done enough. I was in Diane Abbott's borough for a little while. And all I can say is utter lawlessness. And the young jobless black boy men out there who are trouble to themselves and a trouble to the community, but then, really to themselves. It's, I think to a degree it's about perception. It's, yes, people say either young boys can go and become a rap star or a boxer, this is a bully, it's, or they're advertised to young black men on chicken fast food boxes. It's condescending, it is patronising, it's unacceptable. It's, so for me, I think, it's not even about doubling or, we just, got to, by whatever factor, increase the effort in everything that we're doing, because it is unacceptable. It's I thought that to come to my time in life, and it hasn't changed at all. I can't see 58. I mean, I know the 70s very well. I remember that it hasn't changed at all.
Sorry, I'm not sure how to answer. I mean,
Well,
I agree. I agree. There's been very little movement.
Yeah.
Is the problem? I think some of the issues that we talk about in relation to people of colour, young people of colour, whomever, they've been the same. I've been in this sector or in this working on these issues for longer than I care to mention. And when I started out doing my research, I'm not going to say because I'll out my age, but I remember working with Len Garrison. I met him when I was working in Nottingham, and we were talking about the high rates of school exclusions of young black men at the time in schools. And yet again, here we still are talking about the same issues. And whilst maybe the demographic of the group may have changed slightly, in that we've got a range of different groups of young black children being excluded from school, it's still young black children who are still being disproportionately excluded from school. And so the thing that I've always said in relation to that is that whatever it is that we've been doing as a kind of a policy, at a policy level, and with schools it's at a national level, because it's the Department for Education who dictates what happens within our education system, or the academy change, but that's another conversation. Whatever it is that we've been doing in education policy for over 20 years has not made an impact on those young people's lives. If what we've done hasn't made a difference, then we need to change what we're doing. But it's really difficult, I have to say, to get any kind of targeted, specific initiative at the national level to happen. It's just, I can do stuff at the regional government level with Sadiq, which is great, but at the national level, you're either told that racism is no longer an issue because there are so many young people of colour going to university, so therefore we're doing something right, or they say we can't be seen to be doing something which is specific about this group. We have to look at everyone in the round, and when you look at everyone in the round, it's the young people of colour who drop out and who don't get the benefits of that university approach. So I completely agree with you.
It's very important because it's a mental health service as well. The number, the over-representation in the mental health services, go into any mental health ward or mental health centre, and the number of black faces, particularly black men, that you see there. Same with the prison system. So I'm thinking, well, we deny opportunity, and then what tools are you, that's going to create a certain type of pressure. I think the phrase is people snap, then you're either sectioned or in prison. It's nice.
I completely agree.
We've got time for just
Thank
one
you.
last question.
Okay, yeah, go ahead. First of all, thank you for your presentation, Dr. Debbie. Well done to you for what you've achieved, and still being a door opener as you go. So I wish you speed and strength with what else you have to do. Now, it struck me that you recognise something that is spot on, which is that as much as you have an opportunity for influence, and I hope you will continue to have, the specific opportunity you have now is time bound.
Yes.
And so it strikes me that it's a really important time to be using that in a way that what we create is a legacy. And there's two things that come to mind. One of them is, I'm just reading here, and I remember hearing about this memorial years ago when I was much younger. We're talking about 2002. And one of the things I want to ask is, well, why is there so much resistance? What is the barrier? Why should we be in a position? Nobody denies that transatlantic slavery took place. So I think one of the first things we have to do is recognise that at least part of the resistance we're dealing with is intentional. Because all of these things we're talking about, the problems with criminal justice, and you know, they're not all just accidental things. There are people there who know it suits them for this to be as it is. Fair enough, we might not be able to change hearts, but we're really interested in changing hands. And so at least the actions that they do. Hearts would matter, but that can be a bigger job. But we want to at least put people in the place where they have to start to make differences. So I'm asking, with this initiative, even within itself, to what extent is there capacity for you to make a difference? The second thing I wanted to pick up on was your WIN project, which I could just imagine the power there is in seeing all of those young men. Slight concern in my head though, even though it needs to be done regardless, is it having an opportunity to reach those who might have been long-term unemployed, and as is often the case, those who have got criminal records? And what can we do to get those groups who have now become regular employees, it would seem, at the betting shop? So I wanted to ask, how are we accessing them? And we, we laugh, but those betting shops have been ruining communities, and in particularly, they're sapping life out of the black community. The amount of relationships that have been broken. I don't want to wax lyrical, but they have rent that should have been paid, and men who don't even have money to pay their rent but go into bed looking for a place, a black male network, and in some ways the betting shop has started to fulfill that space because we see the youth centres being closed down. Because I remember we even had a black community centre in the area where I lived, and all of a sudden there was some work done, and the next thing we knew, it no longer appeared. And often we don't have the social capital with people with voices. So I want to say those two things. What can you do in relation to the memorial and other memorials in society, and with your WIN network, is it reaching those hard to reach, and what can be done in that respect? Sorry for being so long.
No, it's a good question. So on the WIN project, I think it's a good point. There's a particular age group, so it's from 16 to 24, and I know by the age of 24 you could be long-term unemployed, but it doesn't go beyond that. It's got a particular cut-off age group. But you're right. I think that there isn't enough work that we are doing with young offenders, or with offenders generally, and we know that there are certain things that can help people can prevent reoffending. One is work, one is a relationship, one is sometimes being a parent. I don't know how much that works, and also another is networks and support in your area. With WIN, we focus quite specifically on two sectors. We focused on the construction sector and the tech sector, and we focused on those sectors because they've got a lot of economic growth, which means if you can get your foot in the door in one of those sectors, you can really fly, hopefully, in those sectors. There will be jobs, and there'll be jobs, there'll be work for you, and promotion opportunities. But it's interesting what you say about young people who either have criminal records or who are at risk. One of the borough commander in Camden once said to me that whilst he thought it was great that we were focusing on those sectors and focusing on young black men, the young men that he worked with, some of whom had criminal records, for example, said that they didn't want to work in construction. They didn't want to work in as plumbers or as electricians. These are not the sorts of jobs that they want, but they feel that these are the sorts of jobs that they are being directed towards. And so there is still a job of work to be done to make sure that what we are offering is actually meeting the needs of those young people, or those young people that we are trying to support. Now, one of the things that I will say is that you kind of need to make sure that you're providing young people not just with the work, but with the skills that they need, so that they've got the skills to get the work, but then also to be able to move on in the work that they get. I know that sometimes there is a general perception that you can just get a job here and then that will be it. But actually, we need a skills system that makes sure that you can continuously access the opportunities that you need, so that you don't go into construction or somewhere else and then you get stuck at entry level and that's it, because that's where the risk of being in poverty kind of comes from. So we don't do in WIN. It's not specifically for young offenders. But it doesn't say that we don't work with young offenders. We haven't got a line that says we will not work with. We just have we want to work with young black men who are 16 to 24, and we're working with youth-based organisations who help us to identify the young people to put them into the work. If they bring us young people who have those sorts of experiences and they think that they can benefit from this work, then they should be able to benefit from the work. So we've got no bar to it, but we haven't explicitly targeted it. But I think your point is important, because if we are to tackle reoffending, then we probably need to have initiatives which are specifically for young offenders, because otherwise they won't thrive in the initiative that we've got, because it's not set up for them.
And they sabotage whatever you do put in place, because our societies become risky. And some of those same young men who start to step up become an affront to those who are stuck still in that.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. And on the first point with Oku, so I'm good at shouting at the government. I have to be careful about the amount of shouting that I do in my current role, because obviously I'm responsible now. But we can do all we can to support Oku's attempts to get a shift in the way in which the government have responded to her today, because the government should fund this work. The government have the ability and the funding capacity to be able to support something like this, and therefore they should. I signed Oku's petition. I hope everyone in the room signed the petition. It's sad that it's taken so long, and it is a long process. And I know that you've had interactions with successive prime ministers, I believe.
Yes. When you finish, Debbie, I'd like to read a letter to you that I received last month in response to a letter that I wrote to our present Prime Minister, which will, I think, be quite enlightening, but when you finish it.
Yeah. So I think that, and I think we've all got a role to play in trying to get a shift. I think one of the things that I've learned in my career is that often the pressure to lobby or to try to get decision makers to make a change often sits with a very small and very select group of organisations who are overburdened in doing this work. I know I've spent a lot of time in some of them. I think individually and together en masse, I think we would be surprised by the power that we have to really try to get people to shift, and we all need to play our own part in raising these issues with those who make those decisions. And so we'll continue to champion them all we can to support Oku, but I think, we just have to keep up the good fight in respect to that.
Well, I'd just like to thank Debbie once more for a stimulating talk, and also for the dessert of the questions and answers, the quality of the questions and the even greater quality of the answers. So thank you very much for coming, Debbie. We really appreciate what you've done, and we appreciate what is actually happening. It's good to know what's happening in City Hall, and raising visibility is really, really important. And in the light of the question about the memorial, I have been trying for a long time to get government support. I mean, really, from Blair to the present, it has been no positive response. But I received a letter last month that I'd like to share with you. And really, it's a reflection of all the letters that I've received over the years. In fact, I looked at them recently, and I decided, A, there was a template, and B, it was a cut and paste job. because there were chunks of paragraphs, letters written by different people, but they were identical. And I'd just like to share this one with you. This came from James Younger, who is the Minister of Housing, Communities and Local Government, and he's thanking me for my letter to Boris Johnson. And he says, now this is identical, I've got 3 letters, this same paragraph. Firstly, I'd like to make it clear that the government values and appreciates your continued efforts and hard work to create a memorial to enslaved Africans. Slavery and the slave trade were amongst the most appalling tragedies in history, not only because of the detestable cruelty, but also in terms of their scale, their organised nature, and especially the denial of their humanity. We have expressed deep sorrow for what happened, and we fully recognise the strong sense of injustice that remains. We firmly believe that we should always remember our history, no matter how difficult that may sometimes be. Now, that, what I've just read, appears in 2 other letters, written by 3 different people. So they have a template. They see the name Okwepengan, we've got to respond to it. Let's look in the file. Oh yes, this is what we say to her. Now the next bit, they say, this is why we appreciate and value the International Slavery Museum in Liverpool, which is a fitting tribute to those who were enslaved. Now, if you haven't been to the museum, you won't know that it's just 1 floor in the Maritime Museum. So they're saying that this should be sufficient. He then continues to say, I'm aware that you've been in touch with officials in my department requesting financial support for this memorial, and that the former Director of Integration and Communities, Hardy Burgle, wrote you on the 17th of February explaining that the government does not have any dedicated funds available at present for this memorial. Unfortunately, our position remains the same. Now that I've got in 2 other letters. And that is a nonsense, because it's the government that decides what to dedicate its funding to. To actually say they haven't got it is they're just saying, go away. He concludes by saying the government and MHCLG very much recognise the value of your work to address the issue of slavery. The previous correspondence that you received discussed the nature of our ongoing work on race equality issues. We have been looking to the future by focusing on shared global challenges, including combating contemporary forms of slavery by introducing the Modern Slavery Act in 2015 to stamp out modern slavery, to protect the victims and to bring perpetrators to justice. I get that repeatedly. Now, what they fail to understand is that modern day slavery is illegal. The transatlantic slave trade was legal, and it's addressing a totally different issues. Now, this final sentence, I find, well, I'll read it. I look forward to seeing further updates on your work to tackle the issue of racism and discrimination in British society. Well, that's not my role, it's their role. Why are they telling me that in fact, they are perpetrating racism and discrimination by failing to support this, yet they're telling me to update them on what I'm doing to eradicate this, which I just find really, it left me speechless when I read this. So I haven't addressed it because I feel it's a waste of time and effort, and secondly, come Friday it might be a different minister anyway. You know, one can always live in hope. But the point is, as Debbie mentioned, we have this petition and we're aiming to get 100,000, because if we get 100,000, there is the chance it can be debated in the House of Commons. The petition at the moment stands over just over 57,000. Now, I know several of you here have actually signed the petition, but if you haven't, Steve over here with his laptop.
I'm going to go and catch a train in 2 minutes.
Oh,
Nicholas over here.
right, all right. But if you could just sign up, because every name counts, and it really does mean it is important. And hopefully we can get the government, whoever of the day, to really rethink the situation. Because If this isn't racism and discrimination, ways of tackling, this is one way to move forward, to recognise and value people of African and African heritage. Anyway, because Steve has got to run, he has to go to Weymouth. That's how dedicated he and his wife are. They come all the way from Weymouth every year. So thank you very much for coming. Now is the time to chat, coffee, tea, whatever. And once again, thank you to Debbie for coming.